My name is Alara Sutton, and for 15 years I've lived as a ghost, an invisible presence in my own home. At Christmas dinner, I heard the cruel words, the careless laughter. They pushed me to the corner of the room as if I didn't exist at all. But a ghost can become powerful, especially when it decides to stop hiding. I walked out without a word, silently pursuing a dream they said I was too dumb to ever achieve. Now, 15 years later, I stand on a world stage, accepting an award no one in my family knows about. What will they say when they see the evening news? And will they recognize the ghost they once forgot? Or will they only see a stranger on their television screen? Let me take you back to where it began. There's this thing about Christmas dinner. It's supposed to be about family right, about warmth and love and feeling like you belong. But for me, it always felt more like a stage, and I was never the main character. It was December 24th. The air in New Haven was biting cold outside, but inside our house, my mom Diana had created her usual illusion of warmth. The fireplace crackled, fake snow lined the windowsills, and the scent of cinnamon and roasting ham filled every corner except one, that island, my corner. I was sitting at the edge of the dining table, not at the head, not at the side, with the other family members and our neighbors. I was squeezed between the wall and the heavy wooden buffet. It was a space designed to be ignored, and for 17 years I had perfected the art of occupying it. Across from me, my sister Bethany was holding court. She was 20, a stunning blonde with our mother's smile and my father's confident laugh. She was a natural-born storyteller. Everyone hung on her every word as she talked about her plans for college, her sorority rush, and the expensive new clothes she wanted for Christmas. My parents, Robert and Diana, were mesmerized. My dad's eyes sparkled as he listened, and my mom just beamed, nodding and giggling at all the right moments. I took a slow sip of water from my glass. My throat felt tight. I had something to say too, something important. I had just gotten my acceptance letter to Yale, a full academic scholarship. It was everything I had worked for my entire life. I had aced every test, stayed up every night studying, and worked odd jobs on the weekends to buy my own supplies. My dad had once joked that my room looked more like a library than a bedroom. He didn't know how much that had hurt. I cleared my throat, hoping to get a word in. My mom glanced over, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Oh, Alara, did you need more water, sweetie?" I shook my head. "No, Mom, I just wanted to say something." Bethany didn't even look at me. "Mom, did I tell you about the Alpha Gamma Epsilon house? It's so pretty. They have this huge porch, and they're all so nice. It's going to be so great to finally have some friends who actually get me." I felt my heart sink a little. I had friends, too. I had a whole group of girls in the robotics club, and we spent every afternoon after school in the science lab. We were working on a prototype for a new kind of surgical tool. It was a small team, but we were good. We were so good. But I knew better than to mention it. That stuff was my dad's nerd talk, and Bethany would just call me a dork. I decided to try again. I knew if I didn't say it now, I never would. I got my acceptance letter. My dad's head snapped over to me. He squinted a little as if he didn't quite recognize who was speaking. "What was that, Alara? Speak up, we're all talking." My cheeks felt hot. I said I got my acceptance to Yale. "It's a full scholarship." For a moment, there was silence. I held my breath, waiting for a congratulations, a smile, anything. But my mom just fussed with the napkin on her lap. My dad looked back at Bethany, who was now staring at me with a smirk. Yale, Bethany scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Wow. I'm going to college too, Alara, but I'm not making a big deal out of it." "But it's a full ride," I said softly. "All my tuition, room and board, everything." Bethany let out a short, hollow laugh. "Oh, I guess that makes sense. I mean, they probably had to pay you to go. You're so... you." My dad chuckled. He actually chuckled. It was a low, rumbling sound that made my stomach churn. "Your sister's just kidding, Alara," he said, but his eyes were still on Bethany. "She just has that big personality, you know. It's all in good fun." But it wasn't good fun. It felt like a jab right to the gut. I looked at my mom, hoping for a sign of comfort, a small word of support. But she was looking at the roast ham, her face a blank mask. She pretended she hadn't heard a thing. I felt a tear well up in my eye and I quickly blinked it away. I wouldn't cry, not in front of them. Not ever again. I pushed my chair back from the table. The scrape of the wood against the floor was loud in the sudden quiet. I stood up, and for a fleeting moment I felt all eyes on me. Bethany's face was still twisted in a smirk. My dad was just looking at me blankly, and my mom was just staring down at her plate. I just walked away from the table. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I felt their silence as a final rejection. As I reached the living room, I heard Bethany's voice again, her tone dripping with fake concern. What's her deal so dramatic? It's not like she's a genius. She's just a little slow sometimes, a little dumb. And then my dad laughed. He laughed a big belly laugh that echoed through the house. And in that moment, I knew I would never belong here. The warmth was a lie. The family was a lie. I walked up the stairs to my room and closed the door. But the sound of their laughter, it stayed with me. It followed me into the night. The sound of their laughter followed me into the night, but it didn't keep me awake. I lay there in the dark, my mind buzzing with a strange, cold clarity. It wasn't the sound of my father's laugh that stayed with me. It was the absence of a sound. The silence. The cold, empty silence from my mother. It was the silence of a woman who chose not to speak up. Not for me. Never for me. It was a silence that confirmed everything I had ever known. I was on my own. I had always known it, of course, but that night it became a part of my bones. It was the foundation I would build on. And the first brick I laid was the next morning when I packed 2 suitcases and slipped out of the house. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. My mother saw me from the kitchen window, her hand holding a mug of coffee. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just watched me. I got into my old car and drove away. The drive to Yale University was a blur. It was only an hour and a half from home, a distance I had traveled 100 times for classes and campus tours, but this time felt different. This time I was leaving for good. My heart was pounding a nervous drumbeat in my chest. I felt a surge of fear. What if I was wrong about everything? What if I wasn't good enough? What if my family was right? I pulled up to the historic campus, and the fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet awe. The old stone buildings with their ivy-covered walls seemed to hum with a kind of silent, ancient knowledge. I was a tiny speck in a huge, imposing world, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. I found my way to my assigned dorm room. It was small with a single bed and a desk, but it had a big window that let in so much light. It felt like a palace compared to the cramped corner I had always lived in. I unpacked my things, which didn't take long. I had a few clothes, my books, and a worn-out copy of a textbook on bioengineering that I had saved up for. My mother had always told me not to waste money on that kind of junk. Now that book felt like a treasure. The first few weeks were lonely. I didn't know anyone. I ate alone in the dining hall and studied alone in the library. I watched other students laughing and talking and walking in groups. I felt like an outsider all over again. I even started to doubt my decision. Maybe I should have gone to a state school closer to home. At least then I wouldn't have to feel so alone. But then I found the robotics club. It was a small group of kids, mostly introverts like me, who spent every spare moment in the engineering lab. We were working on a prototype for a new kind of surgical tool. It was a small team, but we were good. We were so good. I felt a spark of hope. I was finally in a place where my passion wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. One afternoon, I was working on a tricky circuit board. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lab. My hands were shaking a little from a long day of work. A man with graying hair and a kind face walked over to me. He was the head of the lab, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a legend in the world of bioengineering, and I was terrified of him. He looked at my work, not saying a word for a long time. I braced myself for a lecture, but then he just smiled. "That's a difficult one, isn't it?" he said. His voice was soft, not at all what I expected. Most students give up on that circuit after a few tries. My heart was pounding. I just can't get the voltage to stabilize, I stammered. He picked up a tool and adjusted a tiny wire. You have a good eye, Alara, he said. You saw the problem, you just didn't know how to fix it. He looked at me, a deep kindness in his eyes. You have a gift. A unique way of thinking. Tears welled up in my eyes. It was the first time in my life that anyone had ever called me gifted. He didn't know about the years of being called dumb. He didn't know about the Christmas dinner. He just saw me. For the first time, I felt seen. I felt a knot in my stomach that had been there my whole life begin to loosen. He was a scientist, not a therapist, but in that moment he healed a part of me that I didn't even know was broken. I knew then that I had made the right choice. I would not go back. I would build something new, and it would be all mine. I would build something new, and it would be all mine. That was the quiet promise I made to myself. I threw myself into my studies, and my work in the lab fueled by the feeling of finally being seen. Yale wasn't just a school to me, it was a second chance. Every late night in the library, every complex problem I solved felt like another step away from the girl they had called dumb at the Christmas dinner table. My bioengineering project for Dr. Thorne's class was my chance to prove myself. Not to him, not to anyone else, but to myself. We were tasked with designing a new prototype for a medical tool, and I knew exactly what I wanted to create: a new kind of surgical robot that could perform delicate procedures with more precision than a human hand. It was an ambitious project, far more complex than anything the other students were doing, but I was determined. I spent most of my nights in the lab hunched over my workbench, surrounded by circuit boards, wires, and schematics. The lab became my sanctuary. The sterile smell of the chemicals, the quiet hum of the machines, it all felt like home. And it was in this sanctuary that I first noticed him. His name was Liam Jensen. He was a few years older than me, a graduate student with a friendly smile and a confident air. He was working on a different project, but he was always there, always watching. At first, I thought he was just curious. He would stop by my bench and ask me about my work, his eyes scanning my schematics. "That's a bold design," he said once, his voice full of what I thought was admiration. "You really think you can make that work?" I felt a thrill of pride. "I'm sure of it," I said, a rare note of confidence in my voice. He just smiled. "We'll see." His words struck me as odd, but I shrugged them off. I was used to people not believing in me. It just fueled my fire. I worked even harder. I stayed even later. My project was a race against the clock, a race against my own past. My parents would call sometimes, but the conversations were always brief and hollow. They never asked about my classes or my project. "How are your friends?" my mom would ask, a question that felt like a test I could never pass. I would just say I was busy and hang up. They didn't seem to mind. The closer I got to my deadline, the more pressure I felt. And the more pressure I felt, the more I began to notice strange things. My lab equipment would sometimes be unplugged or my notes would be moved. I brushed it off at first. The lab was a busy place. But then one night, I found a single wire on my circuit board had been cut. It was a tiny, almost invisible snip, but it was enough to ruin a whole night's work. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't an accident. I looked around the lab, but it was empty. I felt a cold dread settle over me. Someone was trying to sabotage my work. The only person who had been paying any real attention to my project was Liam Jensen. I decided to confront him. It was a rash decision, but I was so angry, so scared. I found him in the student union sipping a coffee. "Did you cut the wire on my circuit board?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me with that same easy smile. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Alara," he said calmly. "What makes you think I would do something like that?" "You're the only one who's been looking at my work," I said, "and you said my design was too bold." "You said it wouldn't work," he laughed, a smooth practice sound. "Everyone looks at each other's work, Alara. That's how we learn. And I'm sorry if I was a little skeptical of your design. It's just a little ahead of its time, isn't it? Maybe you should try something simpler." His words hit me like a physical blow. He was trying to tear me down just like Bethany had. just like my parents had, but this time I wouldn't let it happen. I looked at him, and for the first time I saw him for what he was, a bully hiding behind a smile. I wouldn't beg for his approval. I wouldn't waste my breath trying to convince him. I just walked away. But as I walked, a cold fury began to rise in me. I wouldn't just fix the wire. I would prove him wrong. I would show him that I wasn't just a little ahead of my time. I was building something he couldn't even dream of. And I would do it without his approval or anyone else's. Liam's words had just solidified my resolve. I went back to the lab that night and worked until dawn. I fixed the cut wire, and then I did something else. I created a secure hidden log on my computer. Every time my files were accessed, every time my project was opened, it would leave a digital footprint that only I could see. I wasn't just working on a project anymore. I was preparing for a war. The next few months were a blur of work and little sleep. My classes became a side note to my real passion. The surgical robot prototype was my life. I spent hours and hours perfecting its every movement, its every tiny circuit. I would run tests, analyze data, and then start all over again. I lived on coffee and a strange mix of fear and excitement. I had no social life. I had no friends outside of the few people I spoke to in the lab. I had no life outside of this project. But I didn't care. This was my purpose. But even with my focus, things started to go wrong. My supply orders for specific parts were mysteriously delayed. My access to the lab's more advanced equipment was often restricted without explanation. And worst of all, my data sets kept getting corrupted. It was a slow, subtle sabotage, and I knew exactly who was behind it. But I couldn't prove it. The digital footprint I had created showed that my files were being accessed, but it didn't show who was accessing them. The cameras in the lab were too far away to see anyone at my station. I was trapped in a silent war of my own making. I knew I needed help, but I didn't have anyone to turn to. I thought about going to Dr. Thorne, but I was afraid of what he would say. He had already doubted my abilities once. I couldn't bear to hear another lecture about how my project was too ambitious, so I kept my head down and kept working. I started backing up all my files on a separate hard drive. I began hiding my most important notes in a locked cabinet. I became a ghost working in the shadows, moving in silence. The end of the semester was approaching fast, and I was running out of time. My prototype was almost complete, but the corrupted data was a huge problem. I couldn't submit my final project without it. I was so close, and I felt like I was losing everything. All my hard work, all my sleepless nights, it was all for nothing. I felt the familiar feeling of failure creeping in. It was the same feeling I had on that Christmas night, the same feeling I had when my dad laughed at me. One afternoon, Dr. Thorne found me at my workbench. My head was in my hands. I was exhausted and defeated. He sat down across from me, his face etched with concern. "Alara," he said softly, "you look like you haven't slept in a week." I didn't look up. "I'm fine, Dr. Thorne, just trying to finish my project." He looked at my work for a moment, his eyes scanning the circuit boards. He didn't say a word about my project being too ambitious. Instead, he said, "I know you've been having some trouble in here." "I've been watching." My head shot up. "What, I've been watching the logs," he said. "I know your files have been corrupted. I know your supply orders have been delayed. I know someone is trying to sabotage you." My heart began to pound. He knew. I felt a mix of relief and terror. "Do you know who it is?" I asked. My voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "Number, but I have my suspicions. This kind of behavior, it's not the kind of thing that happens to a mediocre student, Alara. It happens to a genius, someone who is so far ahead of the curve that others feel threatened by them." His words hit me like a wave. A genius. The last time anyone had called me a genius, I was a little girl, and my mom had said it with a forced smile. But this was different. This was real. This was a man I respected, a man who had seen my work, who had seen my heart. He placed his hand on my shoulder. "You have something here, Alara. Something important. Don't let anyone take that from you. Don't give up. Not now." He was right. I was so close, I couldn't give up now. I looked at him, and for the first time I saw him not as a professor, but as a mentor. He was my lifeline. The only person in the world who believed in me. He had a reputation for being tough, for being demanding, but he had a kind of heart that I had never seen before, a heart that saw my potential. I knew I couldn't disappoint him. I knew I had to finish this, not just for me but for him. The next day I started over from scratch with a newfound sense of purpose. I was no longer just preparing for a war. I was fighting one. I was no longer just preparing for a war. I was fighting one. But it wasn't a war against my family, not anymore. This was a new kind of battle, a silent one fought in the sterile glow of a laboratory. And my opponent was a man named Liam Jensen, who had just made the biggest mistake of his life, underestimating me. My first step was to change everything. My project was a target, so I decided to make it harder to hit. I stopped working in the main lab. I packed up all my equipment, all my notebooks, and all my data. I loaded everything into my car and drove straight to Boston. I didn't know anyone there. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get away from everything and everyone at Yale. I found a tiny one-bedroom apartment in an old building. The windows were small, and the living room felt cramped. It was nothing like the dorm room I had so loved. But it had a second bedroom, a small dusty room that I immediately claimed as my lab. I set up my workbench, arranged my equipment, and hung my schematics on the walls. The room smelled of old wood and dust, but to me it smelled like freedom. I found a job as a research assistant at GenCore Bio, a company that specialized in biomedical devices. It was a good job, but I wasn't there for the paycheck. I was there for the access. I spent my days working on their projects, but my nights were dedicated to my own. I was a ghost at the company, a woman with a quiet voice and a blank face. No one knew anything about my past. No one knew about my family. No one knew about the promise I had made to myself. Liam Jensen had a way of getting under my skin. I would see him at industry conferences, his easy smile and confident air always on full display. He was a natural-born salesman, a man who could convince anyone of anything. He had a way of talking about his own work with such swagger that you almost believed he was the next great genius. He would talk about his own work and I would just listen. I would just watch. I learned that the louder a person talks, the less they have to say. One day, I got a call from an old colleague at Yale. She was in a panic. Liam had just given a presentation at a major industry conference, and he was taking all the credit for my old work. He had stolen my initial designs, my early data, everything. He had even changed the name of the project to his own. My colleague was furious. She said she had tried to tell everyone the truth, but no one would listen. "He's just so convincing, Elora," she said. "He's just so good at this." I felt a cold rage rise in me. But it wasn't the kind of rage that made me want to scream or throw things. It was a quiet, controlled anger. It was the kind of anger that you hold inside you, the kind that fuels you. I didn't say a word to my colleague. I didn't need to. I just hung up the phone and got to work. I had an ace up my sleeve. A few weeks before I had left Yale, I had created a secondary program, a virus that would corrupt any data that Liam had stolen. I had a second surprise waiting for him too. A digital paper trail that showed the data was originally mine, with timestamps and file names that he couldn't change. I wasn't just working on a new surgical robot. I was building a trap. I got to work coding late into the night. I sent the program to his computer, and I waited. The next day, I got an email from a news outlet saying that Liam's presentation had been a disaster. The data he had presented was corrupted, and he had been forced to leave the stage in the middle of his speech. The digital paper trail had worked, and it had been made public, proving that the work was originally mine. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to deceive. But he hadn't counted on my silent resolve. He hadn't counted on the girl who had been called dumb her whole life. And in that moment, I knew I had won. Not just a battle, but a war. And in that moment, I knew I had won. Not just a battle, but a war. I had won against Liam, against his smug smile, against his fake confidence, but the victory felt hollow. My research was safe for now, but I knew Liam was a snake. He would be back. I knew I needed to do more than just protect my work. I needed to build something so undeniable, so revolutionary, that no one could ever question its authenticity. I needed to create a masterpiece. I quit my job at GenCore Bio a week later. It was a risky move, but I had a little money saved up and I knew I couldn't finish my work while being tied to a corporate schedule. My little apartment in Boston became my entire world. I lived on ramen noodles and black coffee. My days and nights blurred into one long, continuous stretch of work. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had my schematics, my data, and my goal. I built my prototype from the ground up, one tiny circuit at a time. I was meticulous, obsessed. Every wire was perfectly placed, every line of code was checked and rechecked. I was building a new kind of surgical robot, a machine that could perform delicate procedures with more precision than a human hand. It was my life's work, my magnum opus. And it was all mine. But even as I worked, I felt the ghost of Liam Jensen hovering over me. I knew he was still out there, licking his wounds, plotting his next move. I had to be one step ahead of him. I had to build a trap that he couldn't get out of. So I decided to do something a little crazy. I decided to make my work public. Not to the world, of course. I wasn't ready for that. But to the one person who could truly appreciate it. The one person who had believed in me when no one else would. Dr. Eris Thorne. I sent him an email with the subject line, "A new prototype." I attached my data, my schematics, everything I had worked on for the past 5 years. I didn't ask for a response. I just sent it and waited. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was him. "Alara," he said, his voice, a low rumble. "What is this?" "It's my work," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The project I started at Yale." He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "This isn't a prototype, Alara," he said finally. "This is a revolution. You've done the impossible." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "I had a lot of help," I said, my voice choked with emotion. He laughed softly. "No, you didn't. I've been following your work. I know what you've been through. I know who you've been fighting. You did this on your own." His words were a balm to my soul. He saw me. He saw my work. He saw my pain. And he saw my victory. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. I just wanted to finish it." He was quiet again. "You're a genius, Alara," he said. "And a genius like you needs to be seen. You need to be celebrated. You need to be recognized. I'm going to make sure of that." My heart began to pound. "What are you talking about?" "The PECASE Award," he said. "The Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. It's the highest honor a young scientist can receive. I'm going to nominate you for it." I was speechless. I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Shock, gratitude, and a quiet, burning satisfaction. This was it. This was my chance to show the world what I was capable of. To show my family what they had lost. I spent the next few months working with Dr. Thorne. He helped me prepare my application, my presentation, my whole life story. He had me write about my past, about my family, about the girl who had been called dumb at the Christmas dinner table. He said it was important to show not just my work, but my journey, my story. And for the first time I told it. I told him about Bethany, about Robert and Diana, about the corner by the fireplace, about all the times they had ignored me. I told him about the laugh, the silence, the cold. He listened without judgment. He just nodded and told me to keep writing. He said that my story, my pain, my struggle, it was what made my work so powerful. It was what made me so powerful. I submitted my application in a quiet, anonymous way. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents. I didn't want them to get in the way. I didn't want them to try and take credit for my success. I didn't want them to feel like they had a part in this. I just wanted to win. Not for them, but for me. And for the little girl who had once hid in a corner by the fireplace. And for the little girl who had once hid in a corner by the fireplace, I submitted my application. It was quiet and without fanfare, just the way I had always lived my life. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange kind of calm. I had done all I could. The rest was up to the universe. I went back to my lab, my tiny sanctuary in Boston, and I began to build something new. My little surgical robot was a masterpiece, but it was just the beginning. I had 100 more ideas, 1,000 more dreams. I had no idea if I would win the award or not. It didn't matter. I had already won. But the ghost of Liam Jensen still lingered. He was a constant reminder of the world I had left behind. I would see his name in industry publications, a small note about a failed project or a new lawsuit. I had created a trap for him, a digital trail that led straight to his deception, and he was caught in it. He was a man who lived for the spotlight, and now he was a man who lived in the shadows. It was a kind of karma that was even more satisfying than a public confession. He had tried to steal my light, and in the process he had put out his own. One day I got a call from an old colleague at Yale. She was in a panic. "Did you see the news?" she asked, her voice a frantic whisper. "Liam just gave a presentation at the annual Biotech Summit. It was a complete disaster. He was talking about a new project, a new kind of surgical robot, and the data he presented was all corrupted. It was a mess. I didn't say a word. I just listened." And then she continued. "A journalist asked him about his old work, and someone in the audience shouted out that he had stolen your research. There was a whole article that came out about how he had plagiarized his thesis. It's a whole thing. He's a pariah." I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction. I hadn't lifted a finger. I hadn't said a word. The universe had taken care of it for me. I had just built a better trap. A few months later, I got another call. This time, it was from a number I didn't recognize. Alara Sutton, a smooth professional voice asked, "My name is Peter Johnson. I'm with the White House. I'm calling to inform you that you have been selected as a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. The President would like to present the award to you personally." In Washington, D.C., I felt my heart stop. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking. I had spent so long working in the dark, in the shadows, that the light was blinding. The President. The White House. I was just me, the girl who had once been called dumb. "Miss Sutton," the voice asked a little more urgently. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm still here." I hung up the phone and just stood there in my little lab, surrounded by my machines and my schematics. It was real. It was all real. I was a genius. A genius who was about to be honored by the President of the United States. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This wasn't just a win for me. This was a win for every little girl who had ever been told she wasn't good enough. This was for every woman who had ever been ignored. This was for every person who had ever been pushed into a corner. I called Dr. Thorne immediately. He was so excited he could barely speak. "I knew it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I knew it all along. He was wrong, of course. He hadn't known. No one had. But it was a nice thought. I had done this on my own. I had built this on my own. And now I was going to stand on a stage and accept an award from the President of the United States. And the world would be watching. The world. And my family. They would finally see me. The question was, would they recognize me? Would they even care? I had a feeling I already knew the answer. My heart was still pounding when I hung up the phone. It was a dizzying mix of disbelief and sheer unadulterated joy. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had won something that couldn't be taken away from me. I had built this on my own. I had fought this war on my own. And now I was going to the White House. But even as I felt a surge of pride, a small, quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered a question. What would they think, my family? I hadn't talked to them in years. Not since that night in Connecticut when I had walked out of their lives for good. I had no idea what they were doing, or what they would think when they saw me on television. Would they be proud? Would they be jealous? Would they even care? I had a feeling I already knew the answer. I didn't tell them. I didn't tell anyone. This wasn't a family affair. This was my moment. This was my victory. My parents had made it very clear a long time ago that my life was not their concern. They had their golden child, their Bethany, and she was all they needed. She was their pride and joy. And I was just a ghost, a whisper in the wind. A week later, I was on a flight to Washington, D.C. I was wearing a simple black dress, a dress I had bought with my own money, a dress I had saved up for. I didn't feel like a genius or a scientist or a woman who was about to meet the President of the United States. I just felt like me. A little girl who was about to do something she had been told she could never do. Dr. Thorne met me at the airport. He was smiling a big, wide, genuine smile that made me feel a little more at ease. "You have no idea how proud I am of you, Alara," he said, pulling me into a hug. "I always knew you had it in you." I just smiled. I knew he was wrong. He hadn't known. No one had. But it was a nice thought. I had done this on my own. I had built this on my own. And now I was going to stand on a stage and accept an award from the President of the United States. And the world would be watching. The world. And my family. They would finally see me. The question was, would they recognize me? Would they even care? I had a feeling I already knew the answer. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind. I met with other scientists, other engineers, other brilliant minds who were all there for the same reason. I was so used to being a ghost, a whisper, that I was overwhelmed by all the attention. People wanted to shake my hand. They wanted to talk to me. They wanted to know about my work. They wanted to know about my story. I told them everything. I told them about my passion for bioengineering, about my work on the surgical robot, about my struggles and my failures. I didn't tell them about my family. I didn't tell them about Bethany or Robert or Diana. My story was my own now. It was a story of triumph, not of defeat. The day of the ceremony arrived. The White House was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the building. I was nervous. My hands were shaking. I was about to walk onto a stage in front of the entire world, and I was about to do it alone. Dr. Thorne was there, of course, but he was in the audience. I was on my own. Just me. The girl who had once hid in a corner by the fireplace. The girl who had once been called dumb. I took a deep breath. It was now or never. I walked onto the stage, and the crowd erupted into applause. I couldn't see a thing. The lights were so bright. I just walked one foot in front of the other until I was standing in the center of the stage. The president was standing next to me, smiling. He shook my hand. He looked at me with a kind of awe that I had never seen before. He spoke about my work. He spoke about my passion. He spoke about my dedication. And then he said my name, Ilara Sutton. The crowd erupted into applause again. I just stood there, a small, quiet smile on my face. I had done it. I had won. Not just a battle, but a war. I had won against my family, against Liam, against all the people who had ever doubted me. I had won against myself. I had won against all the voices in my head that had told me I was not good enough. I had proven them all wrong. And in that moment, I knew I had won. Not just a battle, but a war. Not just a battle, but a war. I had fought a war for 15 years, and in a single surreal moment on the stage of the White House, I had won. The applause was a physical thing, a warm, all-consuming sound that washed over me. I stood there holding the award and felt a quiet joy settle in my bones. I was a scientist, a genius, a woman who had overcome, and the entire world was watching. After the ceremony, I was a whirlwind of interviews and handshakes. People I had only read about in textbooks were shaking my hand, telling me they were in awe of my work. They wanted to know everything about my project, my research, my journey. I talked about my passion, my late nights in the lab, my failures and my successes. I told them about my mentor, Dr. Thorne, and the old lab at Yale where my journey had begun. I was an open book, a story waiting to be told. But there were some chapters of my life that I kept to myself. The chapters about my family, about my sister Bethany, about my father Robert, about my mother Diana. They were a part of my story, but they were not a part of my victory. They were the shadows I had walked out of. They were the ghosts I had left behind. I thought about them a lot in those days. I wondered what they were doing. I wondered if they were watching. I wondered if they were proud. I had a feeling I already knew the answer. They were probably watching a different channel. They were probably talking about someone else. They were probably still living in their perfect little world with their perfect little lives. I had no idea what was going on with them. It had been 15 years since I had walked out of their lives for good. 15 years of silence. And I was fine with that. A few days later, I was back in Boston in my little apartment. I was back in my little lab. The award was sitting on my workbench, its gold surface gleaming in the sunlight. It was a beautiful thing. It was a symbol of my victory. But it wasn't my victory. My victory was in my hands, in my work, in my mind. And then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number from Connecticut. My heart began to pound. I hadn't changed my number in 15 years, but they had never called. Not once. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the answer button. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear what they had to say. I just wanted to be left alone. But then I thought about all the years of silence. All the years of being ignored. I had fought this war in the shadows. I had won this war in the shadows. And now I was ready to bring it into the light. I took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Alara, is that you?" a familiar voice said. It was my mother. Her voice was thin and reedy, a voice I barely recognized. "Yes, Mom, it's me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the sound of the television in the background. "Ilara," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw you on the news, on television, at the White House. You looked so beautiful." I felt a cold wave of something I didn't recognize. "Thank you," I said, my voice flat. "Your father and I were so proud," she said. We couldn't believe it, my little girl. A genius. We always knew you had it in you." The words were a dagger to my heart. "You always knew." I asked, my voice a little louder now. "You always knew. You never said a word." She was quiet for a long moment. "We didn't know what to say, sweetie. You were always so quiet, so focused. We didn't want to get in the way. We didn't want to disturb you." I felt a cold rage rise in me. "You didn't want to disturb me," I said, my voice rising. "You ignored me. You let me live in a corner by the fireplace. You let my sister call me dumb, and then you just turned away. You didn't want to disturb me. You just didn't care." There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven. "Alara," she said finally, her voice choked with emotion. "Please, we're so sorry. We just want to talk to you. We just want to see you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "It's too late, Mom," I said. "It's too late." I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking. The rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, cold sadness. I had won the war, but I had lost the family. And I knew then that I had to do something. I had to go back. Not to see them, not to forgive them, but to finish this. To put an end to the ghost of my past. To put an end to the ghost of my past. It was a strange thought, a thought I had never considered before. For 15 years I had run from my past. I had built a new life, a new identity, a new reality. I had won, but the ghost of my past still lingered, and it would continue to linger as long as I let it. I knew I had to do something. I had to go back. Not to see them, not to forgive them, but to finish this. To put an end to the ghost of my past. The thought was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. I was going back to Connecticut. I was going back to the place that had once been my home. I hadn't been back in 15 years. I had no idea what it would look like or what they would look like. I had a feeling I already knew the answer. They would look the same. They would look the same because they hadn't changed. They were still the same people who had ignored me, who had laughed at me, who had let me live in a corner by the fireplace. I didn't call them. I didn't send them a text. I just got in my car and I drove. I drove for an hour and a half, a drive that had once felt like an eternity, but now felt like a blink of an eye. As I got closer to the house, I felt a familiar feeling of dread. It was a physical thing, a cold, heavy blanket that settled over me. I felt like I was 17 again, a little girl who was just trying to be seen. I pulled up to the house. It was the same. The same two-story house, the same manicured lawn, the same perfect little world. I felt a pang of something I didn't recognize, nostalgia, sadness I didn't know. I just sat there in my car looking at the house. I had no idea what to do. I had no idea what to say. Then I saw them, my family. They were all there sitting in the living room. I could see them through the window. My dad Robert was sitting in his usual chair, a magazine in his hand. My mom Diana was sitting on the couch, a cup of tea in her hand. And my sister Bethany was sitting across from them, her face illuminated by the glow of the television. They were all just there. They were all just the same. And then I saw the television. The news was on. A reporter was talking about the PECASE awards. I felt my heart begin to pound. This was it. This was my moment. This was my victory. I watched them, a ghost in my own car, a spectator in my own life. I watched them as the reporter said my name. Alara Sutton. And then the screen showed a picture of me. A picture of me standing on a stage at the White House, with the president standing next to me. I watched them as they watched me. My dad's magazine slipped from his hand. His mouth was open, a small O of shock. My mom's teacup clattered against the saucer, spilling tea all over the coffee table. She just stared at the television, her face, a blank mask. And my sister Bethany, her face was a twisted mask of confusion and disbelief. She just stared at the screen, her mouth open, a soundless scream. They didn't say a word. They didn't move. They just stared at the television. I watched them, and for a long moment I felt a strange kind of satisfaction. They had ignored me for so long. They had laughed at me for so long. They had let me live in a corner by the fireplace for so long. And now they were finally seeing me. They were finally seeing the girl they had called dumb. They were finally seeing the girl they had ignored. They were finally seeing the girl they had left behind. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It wasn't a tear of victory. It was a tear of... I didn't know what it was. It was just a tear. I watched them for a long moment, and then I put my car in reverse. I drove away, a ghost in my own car, a spectator in my own life. I had gone back. I had seen them. I had put an end to the ghost of my past, and now I was ready to start a new life. A life with no ghosts, no shadows, no past. Just me, and my future. And it was going to be beautiful. It was going to be all mine. It was going to be all mine. That was the last thought I had as I drove away from the house in Connecticut. I had gone back, I had seen them, I had shown them what I had become. And now it was time to move on. I was ready to start a new life. A life with no ghosts, no shadows, no past. Just me and my future. And it was going to be beautiful. But the future was a long way off. First, I had to deal with the present. I got back to Boston a few hours later and my phone was already buzzing. A dozen text messages from my mom, a dozen missed calls from my dad, and a long rambling voice message from my sister Bethany. I just stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the delete button. I had no idea what to do. I sat there in my car for a long time just staring at the screen. I had gone back to Connecticut to put an end to the ghost of my past, but the ghost had followed me. It had followed me all the way back to Boston. I knew I couldn't run from it. I knew I had to face it. I opened my phone and I listened to Bethany's voice message. It was a long, rambling message about how she had been so proud of me, how she had always known I was a genius, how she had been so worried about me all these years. Her voice was thick with emotion, but it was also filled with a kind of desperate need. She wanted something from me. I knew it. She had always wanted something from me. I listened to her voice, and I felt a wave of cold rage. She had never been proud of me. She had never worried about me. She had never cared about me. All she had ever cared about was herself, and now she was trying to use me. She was trying to use my success to make herself look better. I deleted the voice message. Then I read my mom's text messages. They were a mix of apologies and forced affection. She kept saying how sorry she was, how she had always wanted to be there for me, how she had always wanted to tell me she loved me, but she never had. Not once. She had always been a ghost, a whisper in the wind. I deleted her text messages. Then I read my dad's text messages. They were all about business. He wanted to know about my work. He wanted to know about my company. He wanted to know if he could invest. He wanted to know if I could give him a job. He wanted to know if I could give him money. He wanted to know if I could give him everything. I deleted his text messages. I sat there for a long time just staring at the empty screen. I had gone back to Connecticut to put an end to the ghost of my past, but the ghost had followed me. It had followed me all the way back to Boston. I knew I couldn't run from it. I knew I had to face it. I went inside my apartment and I called Dr. Thorne. He was the only person in the world who understood me. He was the only person who had ever seen me for who I was. I told him everything. I told him about my trip to Connecticut, about my family, about the ghost of my past. He listened without judgment. He just nodded and told me that it was okay to be angry. It was okay to be sad. It was okay to be hurt. You have to let it go, Ilara, he said. You have to let go of the past. You have to let go of the pain. You have to let go of the anger. You have to let go of the ghosts. You have to let go of them. I knew he was right. I knew I had to let go. But I didn't know how. How do you let go of a lifetime of pain? How do you let go of a lifetime of being ignored? How do you let go of a lifetime of being called dumb? I didn't know. I just didn't know. But I knew I had to try. I had to try to let go. I had to try to forgive. Not for them, but for me. I had to let go of the ghost of my past so I could finally start a new life. A life with no ghosts, no shadows, no past. Just me and my future. And it was going to be beautiful. It was going to be all mine. It was going to be all mine. The words kept echoing in my head, a quiet mantra. I had come to the end of a long journey, and the final destination wasn't about them. It was about me. It was about the girl who had once hid in a corner by the fireplace, and the woman who now owned the entire view. I stayed in Boston for another 6 months, working on a new project that was even more ambitious than my last one. I was no longer a ghost in my own life. I was a force, a woman with a mission. And the mission was to make sure that no other girl ever felt the way I had. I didn't want my story to be one of just revenge. I wanted it to be one of hope. I had been offered a teaching position at a university in Seattle, Washington. The university had a state-of-the-art bioengineering program, and I had been given a full professorship. It was the kind of job I had always dreamed of. A job where I could teach, where I could mentor, where I could help other young women find their passion. I took the job and I moved to Seattle. The day I moved into my new house, I felt a sense of peace I had never felt before. It was a beautiful house, a 2-story home with a big backyard and a little garden in the front. It was nothing like the house in Connecticut. It was a house that I had built, a house that I had earned. It was a house that was all mine. But the house wasn't the only thing that was new. I had also started a new foundation. I had called it the Corner by the Hearth Foundation, in honor of the little girl who had once hid in a corner by the fireplace. The foundation provided scholarships and grants to young women who were studying science and engineering, women who had been told they were not good enough, women who had been pushed into a corner. I wanted to give them a voice. I wanted to give them a chance. I wanted to give them a way out. I had gone back to Connecticut. I had seen them. I had showed them what I had become. But the anger was gone. The sadness was gone. The pain was gone. All that was left was a quiet, cold sense of peace. I had won the war and I was finally ready to move on. I had let go of the past. I had let go of the ghosts. I had let go of them. And in letting go, I had found a new kind of freedom. The last I heard of them was a few months ago. I had heard through a mutual acquaintance that my dad Robert had a heart attack and had to move into a smaller apartment in town. My mom Diana was still at the old house, but she had become a recluse, rarely leaving the house. And my sister Bethany had moved to Europe. I felt a pang of something I didn't recognize. Not sadness, not victory, just a pang. I was sitting in my living room one night, just staring out the window. The moon was out, the stars were out, the world was quiet. I felt a deep sense of peace. I had won the war. I had won the battle. But the victory wasn't just mine. It was a victory for every woman who had ever been pushed into a corner. It was a victory for every girl who had ever been told she wasn't good enough. It was a victory for every person who had ever been ignored. It was a victory for all of us. My story is just one of many. I know that there are so many of you out there who have been through the same thing. So many of you who have been pushed into a corner, who have been told you are not good enough, who have been ignored. I want to hear from you. If you have ever been pushed out of the place that was supposed to be your home, tell me. Would you build something new, or would you go back and knock on that same door again? I would love to hear your story. And if you saw even a small part of yourself in mine, leave a like or drop a note. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the furthest.